It's Wisconsin Today. I'm Kate Archer-Kent.
And I'm Rob Farrett. After years of legal uncertainty, the Wisconsin Supreme Court ruled last week that the state's 19th-century abortion ban is no longer in effect.
It marks the end of a 3-year legal fight that started when Roe v. Wade was overturned, ending the constitutional right to an abortion nationwide.
The state's high court ruling affirms that abortions are legal in Wisconsin up to 20 weeks of pregnancy or beyond if necessary to save the life or health of the mother in a medical emergency.
So how will this ruling affect patient care and hospital policies and practices? We're joined now by Dr. Abigail Cutler, an assistant professor and academic specialist in obstetrics and gynecology at the UW School of Medicine and Public Health. She was lead author of a study earlier this year that documented the experiences of Wisconsin OBGYNs after the fall of Roe. Dr. Cutler, welcome back to Wisconsin Today.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
What might change now for you and your patients after the Wisconsin Supreme Court ruling?
I think for providers, the ruling really affirms that abortion is legal in Wisconsin, but it is also subject to the many restrictions that existed in Wisconsin prior to Dobbs. So stated a different way, it means that physicians can feel comfortable providing clinical care, but in the same way we did before the Dobbs decision, without the fear that this 1849 statute criminalizes abortion under nearly all circumstances, as you mentioned. So this is pretty important for doctors or hospitals or health systems that following the Dobbs decision may have changed the type of pregnancy care they were providing because of the threat that that law posed. For patients, it means that abortion is legal in Wisconsin. There is no abortion ban. That said, thanks to all those restrictions and state laws still on the books, abortion is still heavily restricted and highly regulated here in our state, which makes it really difficult for patients to access that care.
Can you give us some examples of what restrictions and rules are on the books that patients should be aware of?
Sure. So here in Wisconsin, we have a multitude of state laws, most of which lack medical or scientific basis and interfere really dangerously in the doctor-patient relationship. All of them heavily limit our ability to both obtain and provide abortion care. So in the decades leading up to Dobbs, Wisconsin passed law after law that restricted abortion care. We have a 20-week post-fertilization ban, which I should emphasize really translates to a 22-week ban based on the way we actually date pregnancies in medicine. A 24-hour mandated waiting period, mandated counseling and ultrasound requirements, a ban on telehealth for anything having to do with abortion, really specific regulations when it comes to the provision of medication or pill abortion. And most consequential, in my mind, is a state law that prohibits the use of public funding for abortion services. And so prohibits any insurance plan sold on the ACA marketplace in Wisconsin from covering abortion care, which also means that many private insurers do not offer insurance coverage for abortion. So that translates, to a vast majority of Wisconsinites who do not have insurance coverage for abortion in a hospital-based setting or otherwise. So most patients can really only afford to have their care, with limited exception, in a freestanding clinic like Planned Parenthood.
And I want to stop you right there because I think you're referring to the Hyde Amendment already prohibiting federal funds from being used on abortion care. On Friday, President Trump signed his sweeping tax cut and spending bill that has implications for Medicaid payments to clinics that provide abortion services. How might this affect abortion access in Wisconsin?
It's a good question that a lot of people are spending a lot of time thinking about right now. So blocking Medicaid payments to healthcare organizations like Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin, organizations that provide abortion, means that all of Wisconsin's patients of reproductive age who have Medicaid insurance and get their healthcare services from Planned Parenthood, even if it's not abortion care, will lose their current source of healthcare. And this is going to hit hardest the communities that already face the greatest health inequities in our state. But if we play this out further, if Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin centers close as a result, which they may have to do because they rely on that funding from Medicaid to provide contraception services, STI screening, not only will people of low means or limited insurance not be able to access those non-abortion reproductive healthcare services from those family planning centers. But here in Wisconsin, it could jeopardize the ability of everyone, regardless of means, to access abortion care when they need it from the state's largest provider of abortion care. Many people have referred to this Medicaid bill as a backdoor national abortion ban because it's estimated that the bill will force a large proportion of abortion providers to close across the country. But honestly, the bill is way worse than a national abortion ban because at the same time, it could make abortion inaccessible by forcing clinics to close. It also shuts down the clinics providing contraception. So with it, we're taking away from people their ability to access birth control and contraception and prevent unwanted pregnancy in the first place.
We're talking with Dr. Abigail Cutler, assistant professor and academic specialist in obstetrics and gynecology at the UW School of Medicine and Public Health and a practicing OBGYN at UW Health. You authored this study earlier this year about the experiences of Wisconsin OBGYNs after the fall of Roe, and you heard from physicians around the state that this law was vague and uninterpretable, and you found that the 1849 law was detrimental to providing timely and safe obstetrical care. Do you feel, are those barriers lifted with this ruling?
I hope so. 3 years later, following the fall of Roe, we have evidence, research documenting the experiences of obstetrician gynecologists across our state who, along with their hospitals, really struggle to know how to apply this vague and uninterpretable statute to their clinical practice without breaking the law. And we know that that led to wide variations in the kind of care that Wisconsin hospitals or health systems were providing patients during that time, which meant that pregnant Wisconsinites facing the same unfortunate pregnancy complications sometimes received completely different care with potentially, completely different outcomes, all because they found themselves at different hospitals. So my hope is that the repeal of this law will help providers, physicians, hospitals, health systems offer more consistent care that is aligned with our evidence base and that is patient-centered and that is really in accordance with medical standards. But it's hard to know exactly how it will all play out, again, just given the multitude of state restrictions that already make it difficult for patients to access abortion care, but also providers to provide it.
And it's interesting, in your research, you found differing care, as you just said, from one hospital to the next. And I wonder, will this then lead to more hospitals rewriting their policies and practices related to abortion care?
I have no idea. I do hope that having been through the last 3 years was a lesson for many of what it looks like when abortion is restricted, particularly when there are threats of criminalization for providing it. And my hope is that providers and hospitals and health systems will take the lessons learned from the last 3 years and do everything we can to reverse barriers where we are able to, so that our patients can access the care that they deserve and need.
Has the future OBGYN workforce in Wisconsin been affected in ways we might not realize now or perhaps not fully understand?
I do think there is emerging research and evidence, certainly that tells us that, the restrictions in place, the threats of criminalization, the barriers that make it really hard to do the job of a physician or a healthcare provider has thrown into question, for some people, whether they want to continue to be providing that care in a place that makes it so hard for them. I think that time will tell as more and more data emerges from not just here in Wisconsin, from when we had 15 to 18 months of true inaccessible care, but 3 years of uncertainty that made it difficult to plan. And it's not just here in Wisconsin, but states all across the country where abortion is or has been restricted.
I want to circle back to Planned Parenthood. In 2024, they filed a petition with the state's high court arguing that the 1849 law violated certain rights outlined in our state constitution, including our right to bodily autonomy. The court dismissed that suit last week with the most recent ruling. Do you think there should be further rulings beyond this one targeting the 1849 law to more broadly protect abortion care in Wisconsin?
It's a good question. I do think it's really important to note following last week's news that the court's decision did not address whether the right to abortion is protected in the Wisconsin state constitution. And what that means is that while the 1849 statute has been struck down, again, meaning abortion is legal in Wisconsin, even while subject to all the other statutory restrictions in place, there's nothing about last week's ruling that would prevent the state legislature from advancing a new law banning abortion. And again, we know that last week's decision doesn't stop U.S. Congress, for that matter, from trying to pass any number of other laws that could further restrict, ban, or completely undermine our ability to access or provide this common reproductive health care need.
When we last spoke, you called it a scary time to be pregnant, to be capable of pregnancy, or to provide obstetrical care. In our final moments together, is it still scary?
I do think it's scary. I think the uncertainty around, how laws, federal laws, state level restrictions impede our abilities to exercise reproductive autonomy, control over our own bodies and reproductive futures, makes it very challenging for people who are capable of pregnancy from making decisions that are personal and private. And certainly for those of us who provide pregnancy-related health care, when our ability to provide that care is tied to laws and restrictions.
And we have to leave it there. Dr. Abigail Cutler with the UW School of Medicine and Public Health, thank you so much for your time.
Coming up, UW-Madison geoscientists are running experiments on what's known as the doomsday glacier in Antarctica to help answer critical questions about a changing climate.
How do we improve sea level rise predictions by understanding the fundamentals of it better? The other one is evaluate ideas that have the potential to slow sea level rise.
A look at the Arrête Glacier Initiative next on WPR News.
You're listening to Wisconsin Today. I'm Kate Archer-Kent.
And I'm Rob Farrett. A pair of UW-Madison scientists are the first grant recipients in a new initiative to better understand and potentially prevent giant glaciers from melting because of global climate change.
They are part of a collaboration called the Arrête Glacier Initiative. The scientists want to find out if and how humans can prevent the loss of glaciers. And at the center of their research is the Thwaites Glacier in Antarctica, often referred to as the Doomsday Glacier.
If left unchecked, disappearing glaciers could raise sea levels by more than 10 feet, reshaping continents worldwide and displacing millions of people.
To learn more about efforts to stop sea level rise, the two UW-Madison researchers join us. Marianne Haseloff is an assistant professor in the Department of Geoscience. Marianne, welcome to Wisconsin Today.
Thank you for having me.
And Luke Zoot is an associate professor in the Department of Geoscience at UW-Madison. Luke, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Luke, the Arrête Glacier Initiative, working to improve our understanding of glaciers and sea level rise. Of particular focus is the Thwaites Glacier in West Antarctica. Why is this glacier so telling?
Thwaites is an interesting glacier. It's named after a glacial geologist from Wisconsin that was a professor here a long time ago. And it's interesting because the bed of it, so imagine a glacier is a big piece of ice, but at the bottom, it's sitting on the ground. It's sitting on either rocks or sediment. But in the case of glacier, or in the case of Thwaites, the glacier bed is sloped backwards, which means as you walk away from the coast and towards the center of the continent, it actually gets deeper and deeper and deeper. And in situations where you have that bed that gets deeper and deeper and deeper, we call it a retrograde slope. if their front of them is up against the ocean, they can sometimes have an instability, meaning that as they retreat, they flux more ice out, which causes them to retreat more, which causes them to flux more ice out, which causes them to retreat more. And this can cascade in a way where that glacier could potentially retreat much more quickly than other types of glaciers. And it's particularly important for Thwaites because Thwaites is kind of like the plug in the bathtub for a lot of the other glaciers in West Antarctica in particular. It's sort of this high spot. And if you were to quickly drain the ice out of Thwaites or collapse it, all the other glaciers in West Antarctica would respond to it fairly quickly, and they would potentially start to flow faster and discharge ice into the water quite a bit quicker. So sometimes it's called the weak underbelly of West Antarctica because of this retrograde slope and because of this ability for it to potentially cause lots of destabilization, in particular the West Antarctic ice sheet.
It's been also referred to as the Doomsday Glacier. Why is that?
For the same reason, because it can quickly retreat, and in it is the potential to cause sea level rise to go up, quite a bit, a couple of meters in particular, a meter or so just from the ice in Thwaites, and a couple of meters if you account for the other ice that's sort of bottlenecked by Thwaites being there. And if you remove that bottleneck of Thwaites and those start to contribute, you can get quite a bit of sea level rise. And importantly, you could potentially get quite a bit of sea level rise in a short period of time. And that is sort of at the heart of the problem of, how quickly is the sea level rise going to go up means that's how quickly humans have to adapt to it. And Thwaites is an area where you could potentially cause it to rise faster than in other areas which are more stable or don't have bed conditions that are as conducive to this relatively rapid retreat of the front.
Luke, can you talk about the domino effect of sea level rise and if the wall of ice continues to melt, what impact does that have on communities and people migrating to higher land?
Part of the complexity of a lot of coastlines, especially like along, say, the east coast of the United States, is that the slope of the land is actually really shallow, something like maybe 1 to 100, which means if you walk 100 meters in or 100 feet in from the shoreline, you'll go up 1 foot. So what that means is that if you have 1 foot of sea level rise increase in a particular area, you're going to have inundation of 100 meters of the shoreline. And not only that, you're going to bring the shoreline landward, but it's going to exacerbate all these other problems like tides and things like that. In places like Miami, have big tidal sequences. And if you just raise the baseline water level, the effects of those tides will be felt farther inland, and you'll get more of these nuisance flooding events where places, experience flooding during high tides. It's not necessarily even have to be attributed to a storm or anything. It could just be the high tide overwhelms the drainage capability of the region. And then if you add on top of that, rain events, you can get compound flooding. And so by increasing sea level, you're sort of increasing the base level, and everything else has to adjust to it. It is sort of the bottom line, in some respects. If you do that, everything else in the system has to adjust. And if you raise it fast, that means things have to adjust fast. You have to have resilience. You have to have planning in place to move these communities, more quickly, or try to come up with other types of solutions to protect those types of communities. Whereas if it's slow, you have more time to adapt and things like that. And so coastal communities care a lot about sea level rise, but they also care about the rate, and they also care about like what can they do? How much can their particular community withstand in terms of flooding and things like that for their community infrastructure.
Marianne, you are crunching numbers on this bottom line, developing a mathematical method to improve forecasts for how rapidly glaciers will slide into the ocean. What are you aiming to accomplish with your calculations?
At the moment, a lot of our research is focused on understanding the physics that govern how fast ice sheets can move. Might think of ice sheets as stationary bodies that do not really evolve in time, but they can surprisingly move quite fast at some times. And so a lot of our research is focused on trying to understand the mechanisms by which ice sheets and glaciers move. And a particular focus is the interface of the ice and the bed. So this small area where the ice sits on the bed, where we really have to understand the physics right to know how slippery the bed is.
Why do ice sheets move? What causes them to start moving?
Gravity is the main driver of ice, or is the driver of ice sheet motion. So if you think of honey being squirted on a piece of toast,
Yes.
would start moving like a very viscous fluid and eventually drip over your toast if you let it go long enough. Ice sheets are very similar in the way they behave, just on much longer time scales and on much bigger spatial scales. But the ice sheet can move by what's called internal deformation, like ice. But a much faster mechanism is the sliding of ice along the bed. So if you live in Wisconsin, there's a chance that you have at some point stepped on ice that was just a little bit wet, maybe, early spring. And maybe you even fell down because it's so slippery. And the same goes for ice sheets. When they sit on a bed where it's just a thin film of water, for instance, then that can help the ice sheet slide along. And understanding that is really important in understanding West Antarctica.
We're talking about new research to better understand and prevent glacial melt with Marianne Haseloff and Luke Zoot, two researchers with the Department of Geoscience at UW-Madison. Luke, your research for the Arret Glacier Initiative will work to create a machine to make a simulated glacier called a cryogenic ring shear. Can you walk us through this device?
Yeah, it's a cryo ring shear device. And so an analogy I like to use is that if you say you put an ice cube on a board and then you tip the board, what would happen is the ice cube would slide over the board, and it would maybe the ice cube would deform a little bit, but most of the motion would come from it slipping over the board. And so that contact right where the ice sits on the bed, right where the ice sits on the board, that friction is really important for regulating how fast it will move. If the board's really bumpy, maybe it doesn't move as fast. If it's smooth, it moves faster. And so that zone right at the bottom of the glacier, right where it's at the bed, just like Marianne said, is particularly important. Now, the thing that's complicated is a lot of the times those physical processes are, buried under miles of ice, right? We can walk around on the surface of them, but what we really want to know is happening, in this small zone right at the bottom of the glacier that might only be a foot or 2 feet in depth, right where that ice is sitting on the bed. And so what we have at UW-Madison right now, and what is the focus of this project, is to build these machines. And so in glaciology, lots of work has been done through time by people going out on glaciers and monitoring things and doing theoretical advancements. But unlike in other sort of more mature sciences, a lot of those things haven't been tested in a real quantitative way in a laboratory setting. And that's simply because the laboratory experiments are very difficult to conduct. You need a lot of conditions to be just right, and they've been hard to do over time, especially experiments aimed at trying to look at this basal slip right at the interface. And so at Madison, what we've built is called a large diameter ring shear device. And we have one already. Right now, it's the only functioning one in the world. And we're planning to build a second one as part of this project that's underway. And what it is imagine a big donut of ice that's about 1 meter in diameter or 3 feet in diameter. And that donut of ice is pressed on top. It's sitting on top of another donut of sediment, right? Mm-hmm. And then those two things are pressed together with a huge ram. And that ram pushes the ice against the sediment as hard as the glacier would push on its bed in the real world. And then that donut of ice is gripped from the top and spun in a circle over the bed very slowly, or at the same speed of the glacier moves. And when we do that, we can do a couple things. Importantly, though, we can spin it at a certain rate, and we can measure how hard it is to spin it that fast. Like if we spin it at 10 meters a year, how much sort of force do we have to put in to spin it that fast? If we spin it 20 meters a year, is that twice as much force, or 2/3 as much, or 5 times as much? And we can build this up systematically in a lab. And what that allows us to do is interrogate things called sliding laws. And the sliding law is sort of one of the two main constituent equations that you need for modeling ice sheets. And that's what the thing that allows you to take the gravity and take the geometry of the glacier and make a prediction of how fast it'll actually slip over the bed. In nature, it's really hard to do because there's so many things going on simultaneously that it can be difficult to untangle one part from the other.
Mm-hmm.
But in the lab, we can systematically change one variable at a time and see how it responds. And so it takes all the complexity of the real world and puts it in a system where we can control it. And then that whole thing is inside of a giant tub of antifreeze that lets us regulate the temperature to 100th of a degree. And then that whole thing sits inside a giant walk-in freezer. So we
Wow.
run the experiments they take months to run one experiment. But the data is really useful.
I wonder, can you connect this to basal intervention here, Luke, and how understanding how these ice sheets are moving, what this could mean for artificially connecting, the glacier to its bottom bed of ice?
So an analogy I always like to describe how a glacier moves is if you've ever played air hockey, like an air hockey table.
Yeah.
You have that little puck, and then you have the holes in the table that are blowing air up, and they're sort of pushing the puck up. And if you flick that puck, it's going to go a certain speed. But if you turn that air pressure down on the table, and that puck isn't floating as much, and it's kind of bumping on the table, and then you flick it with the same sort of strength, it's not going to go as fast, and it's not going to go as far. At the bottom of a glacier, that air pressure is just like the water pressure. So if the water pressure is real high, it helps sort of float the glacier off the bed. And in gravity pulling it down, the slope gets way more bang for its buck if the air pressure is high than if it's low. And so one strategy that people have proposed to try to help slow down glacier flow is to drill holes all the way through the glacier, so through 2 kilometers or a mile and a half of ice, and suck the water out. Basically put a huge well down there and suck that water out and blow it up on the surface where it'll, if it's cold enough, turn to snow and fall down. And if you did that, you pulled enough of that water out, you could turn down that water pressure. You could turn down that air pressure on the air hockey table, and more tightly couple it to the bed. This has been proposed. There's aspects of it that maybe haven't been all the way thought through or are hard to simulate in a natural environment. And so that's where the ring shear experiments in the lab comes into play. We can do that. We can drill a hole through the ice and we can suck the water out from the bed. All the while, we can see what's happening to the bed as we're doing that. We can see what's happening to how fast the glacier is moving, and we can include a lot of these complexities that you might have in the real world, but that are hard to sort of put together from first principles without these types of observations as sort of a midpoint between the field and theory.
Marianne, it may still take thousands of years for the West Antarctic ice sheet to perhaps completely melt. What is the urgency for your calculations right now? Why do we need to understand this, if it does take thousands of years to melt?
So the main concern with the West Antarctic ice sheet is not so much that it will melt by surface melting because it's warm there. It's actually still relatively cold. It is the chance that the ice sheet might slide very fast into the ocean. And as you put ice cubes on a glass and, your glass might overflow, similarly, this can raise sea levels. So it's a response in which the ice sheet can move very quickly, and this can go much faster than melting alone. While it can be triggered by, for instance, ocean melting, the response can become self-sustained and fast through dynamic processes that are internal to the ice sheet, rather than, just melting at the surface.
Which brings us back, Luke, to the collaboration at hand for the Arret Glacier Initiative. It's MIT and Dartmouth, UW-Madison, other universities that have other capacities. Can you talk about the challenges of coordinating all of this research?
Yeah, so the research is largely coordinated by our colleagues at Dartmouth and MIT, and they sort of do all the hard work that Marianne and I don't want to do of, putting the foundation together, looking for funding, things like that. And then people like Marianne and I get to benefit from it. We have to propose ideas that sort of could be interesting under the types of things that RET wants to look at. So RET kind of has two main focuses. One is to just improve the fundamentals of glaciology. Just how do we improve sea level rise predictions by understanding the fundamentals of it better. And then the other one is evaluate ideas that have the potential to slow sea level rise. And so it's got sort of these two arms of what it's trying to do, and they're interacting with each other and they're crisscrossing and things like that. So what we try to do is look at these ideas, some of these ones that have been put out there, and see, are they viable? Are they not viable? What types of problems do they have? What types of problems do they don't have? And, a RED is kind of agnostic to it. They just want to know the fundamentals better. And so that's the types of things that Marianne and I have proposed to do.
Luke and Marianne, thank you so much for breaking down your research, taking us inside the research, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
That is Luke Zoot and Marianne Haseloff. They are in the Department of Geoscience at UW-Madison, and they're part of the ARET Glacier Initiative. That's a coalition of researchers who are exploring if and how humans could prevent the loss of giant glaciers and prevent catastrophic sea level rise.
Coming up, a new book tells the story of the Great Lakes area in 50 maps.
Some of the most fun is looking at those old maps of the Great Lakes region and just how wrong they were.
That's next here on Wisconsin Today. It's Wisconsin Today. I'm Rob Farrett.
And I'm Kate Archer-Kent. Folklore around Devil's Lake in Baraboo includes the legend of a mythological squid or octopus-like monster spotted in the water.
That's just one of several lake monster sightings around Wisconsin and the Midwest area that show up in a new book of maps of the Great Lakes region.
The maps highlight the culture, ecology, infrastructure, and economy and monsters of the area, and they tell a visual story about the Great Lakes and the people who live around them.
Alex B. Hill is a cartographer, an anthropologist, and an adjunct professor at Wayne State University in Detroit. His new book is called Great Lakes in 50 Maps. Alex, welcome to Wisconsin Today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
All right, so you're a cartographer, you do data visualizations. What made you want to use those skills to tell the story of the Great Lakes?
Yeah, the Great Lakes are where I'm born and raised. I can't say I ever thought about being from the Great Lakes, but I definitely am. And I didn't really realize it until I started mapping it out. But my upbringing, my childhood, and my family are all across the Great Lakes region. My family would vacation at Point Pelee National Park in Ontario. We would regularly drive through both parts of Michigan to visit cousins in Duluth. So we were really all over the Great Lakes region, and that was kind of nice to be able to tie some of the data to my own upbringing.
And that's interesting to me. I'm from Michigan, spent most of my life now in Wisconsin, and I never really thought of myself as a Great Lakesian. But looking at your maps, there's a lot that unites this region, a lot of things that bring us together. We don't feel that shared identity, but it's there somehow, it feels like.
Right, absolutely. And it's, when I see people with there's that Great Lakes bumper sticker, window sticker on people's cars, you can find that. Sure, there's a lot of people in Michigan with those, but I see those all across the region as well. And it really is, whether it's just thinking about the economy of the region, that, in some parts is fostered by the lakes, but then also just the tourism that happens across states in our Great Lakes region is really really amazing.
Now, when we talk about the Midwest, well, you can get arguments, maybe even violent arguments about which states count and which states don't. Great Lakes region, you define it, and your maps define it. You get a couple different footprints. Can you talk about how you define the Great Lakes region in your maps?
Yeah, that was a bit of a debate because the publisher I'm working with, Belt Publishing, they focus on the Rust Belt region, which that's its own debate. What is that? And so then we started thinking about what does that mean for the Great Lakes? Because we clearly, if you're a state or a province that borders the Great Lakes, you're included in that. But then the Great Lakes watershed extends a little further. And if you're really thinking about kind of that economic, I think it was billed as the Great Lakes megalopolis, kind of that economic region. You start reaching further south, kind of away from the lakes. So I chose to keep a broad definition. It still ends up being the same 8 U.S. states and 2 Canadian provinces that have the most interplay with the lakes and interaction in the region.
Turning to the maps now, 50 of them here, and they're, some very serious, impact of climate change, for example, some more lighthearted, access to football teams and things like that. We'll get into some of the details. How did you decide what maps made the cut?
That was tough because I previously did the Detroit in 50 Maps book. And at that point, I had been mapping Detroit for 10 years. So I had a lot to pull from. But for the Great Lakes book, I had just started as a kind of cartographer in residence for the Great Lakes Now program on Detroit PBS. And so I'd made maybe a dozen maps of the Great Lakes region. I hadn't really explored what was out there. So I started with a spreadsheet and I started asking family and friends and colleagues, what's interesting to you about the Great Lakes? And I think I had a spreadsheet of about, I want to say it was about 75 different ideas. And some things, data was easy to track down and tell the story about. Others, it just wasn't going to be possible. But thankfully, there's a great data set of lake monsters. So that made it.
Let's start with the lake monsters. Sure. There are more than I have heard of, actually, that show up on your maps. What kind of stories maybe surprised you about, you put it very politely, something like, well, there isn't really scientific evidence for these. But what struck you about some of these lake monster stories?
Yeah, well, I think, just being able to see what are they call the sturgeon, the dinosaur fish, and then you have the muskie as well. If you saw those in a lake, I might think that there was a sea serpent in there as well. For me, I might have to create the sea serpent road trip book or something after this, because I was surprised that there were so many too. But it even went beyond just sea serpents. I think it was a lake in Illinois that had an oversized turtle story. Somewhere along Lake Superior, there's a black panther. So there's a lot of interesting lore around the Great Lakes.
You share some of the cultural history around the Great Lakes, including a lot of the indigenous connections and the sources of names of, in some cases, the lakes themselves and the regions. What kind of things did you find that you represent in the text around the maps about the names that attach themselves on and around the lakes?
Yeah, I was most surprised that a lot of the names that we use currently are either adulterations or, right, you misheard the name and now we call it this and spell it in a different way. But I was really surprised that a lot of those indigenous names still are still in use in different forms. But then that was a big piece of the book research for me, was kind of going back to those various European expansions in the quote unquote New World, and just the indigenous connections with water were so significant. And that showed up in a lot of their naming practices across the Great Lakes region.
We're talking to anthropologist and cartographer Alex B. Hill about his new book, Great Lakes in 50 Maps, the 50 maps that tell the story, the physical, the cultural, the economic story of the Great Lakes region. Surfing. People around the country may not think of the Great Lakes as a surfing hotspot. In Wisconsin, we know Sheboygan and elsewhere on the shores of Lake Michigan, and you have a surfing map. And that seems like our surfing in the Great Lakes is concentrated mostly in Lake Michigan, you found.
Yeah, it's definitely, I was honestly surprised that it's an activity that you can do in any of the Great Lakes, somewhere. The first story that I ever heard was the guy who was surfing in Lake Superior and had icicles stuck in his beard. I don't know if I would choose to surf there. But and then, right now we have there's a new organization. I think it's the Great Lakes Surfing Association, that I think they're trying to put together one of their, I can't remember if they've already had a surfing event or if they're planning one, but it's definitely gaining popularity. I don't know if we're going to get, California level, but the Great Lakes have some pretty significant waves and swells. I guess the partner map to that is the shipwrecks. Mm-hmm. That really demonstrate our how large our lakes are and the height that the waters can really get.
I want to dig into a couple of the themes. One is the environment. You've got maps on the impact of climate change, invasive species risk, wetlands, and things like that. As you assembled these environmentally themed maps of the Great Lakes region, what kind of things struck you and stood out to you?
The thing that stood out the most to me, whether I was talking with someone working in the policy arena or even just researchers at various universities, they kept talking to me about how the climate regions and the temperature zones were going to just keep moving north. So in particular, there's a map there of sugar maples, where we get our maple syrup. And Ontario has a lock on producing the most maple syrup, and maybe they might end up producing all of it because that climate region is just going to keep moving north, and we're going to lose a lot of sugar maples in the U.S. states.
And that sugar maple map takes me to my next theme. That's environmental, but also economic. And you've got some amazing maps of things like transportation infrastructure, power plants across the region, and more. What kind of what kind of stories do you tell when it comes to the economics of the Great Lakes region?
Yeah, that's really where that Great Lakes megalopolis comes in, and just the level of trade that we have going on between our various states. And the economic benefit that the lakes provide. It's in the billions of dollars just from thinking about freight shipping, which there's a good amount of it on the Great Lakes, but it's nothing like the port cities on the ocean coasts. And I think when we think about things like infrastructure, it's easy to not think about how connected we actually are. Even with some of the more recent tariff discussions, parts of Michigan are supplied by Canadian power. And so we're even doing kind of international infrastructure sharing.
I'm looking at your wind turbine map here, and this is one where just the visuals really stand out. Wisconsin, compared to neighboring states, especially Illinois and Minnesota, really lagging. Very, very small hexagons mapping our wind turbines versus huge regions in Michigan, too, Illinois, Minnesota. Can you talk about the value of data visualizations and maybe showing missed opportunities for some parts of the region?
Right, absolutely. So I think some of these hopefully highlight where different states have taken on different policy angles. Some have gone further into clean energy than others, and I think we can look at the data and see how well some of those have performed versus different states that have decided not to invest in clean energy as much.
You have mixed in often as chapter heading some historical maps of the Great Lakes region. How was that a fun part of the research on this, looking at how your cartographic predecessors had viewed our region?
Oh yes, that was. I think some of the most fun is looking at those old maps of the Great Lakes region, and just how wrong they were. They really had no idea what they were getting into or looking at, and that nearly caused us to have a war with Ohio, us being Michigan, Ohio. Because the southernmost tip of Lake Michigan was supposed to be the kind of the straight line that went across as the southernmost border of Michigan. But early cartographers had the lake completely wrong. It was way bigger than they had imagined. And so that generated a border dispute between Michigan and Ohio.
Shots
where
were
troops
fired.
Were mobilized.
Yes.
Yes, right.
And that's why the Upper Peninsula is part of Michigan and not Wisconsin.
Right.
in the ultimate compromise. I wanted to ask, sometimes in the media, I'm going to look for data on whatever, and it turns out, well, nobody's keeping data on whatever. Were there maps you were hoping to do and just found like there was a gulf, there was a deficit of data that meant you really didn't have a map to make?
Yeah, there definitely were. I started with a list of about 75 ideas, and ultimately had to drop a number of them because it was either too difficult to find the data or track it down. One example I did end up making the map, but it took a lot of extra work because I wanted to look at the volume of cargo going through these different shipping ports on the Great Lakes, and there's no single source. You either have to try to hunt the data down from each individual port authority, or you pay for the data from some other vendor that's actually collecting it. And so that made it tough.
And finally, having done all these maps, and you've been in the Midwest and the Great Lakes all your life, but did this experience make you want to visit any more parts of the Great Lakes region that you haven't been to yet?
Absolutely. I really want to visit Wisconsin more. The most
good answer.
The most I've the most I've visited is being from a peninsula. I went to Door County. But I'd love to do more exploring in Wisconsin.
Oh, and finally, you're a map guy. An argument in my family, being from Michigan, my family, raised in Wisconsin. Which state is the Mitten State?
Oh, well, there's only one Mitten State, and that's definitely Michigan.
And I agree. And I don't know how anybody could see it different, but I promise you they're out there. Alex, it's been a lot of fun. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Alex B. Hill is an anthropologist and cartographer based in Detroit and an adjunct professor at Wayne State University. He's with us to share his new book. It's called Great Lakes in 50 Maps.
Next week on the show, we'll meet two Wisconsinites who have each donated a kidney for use in transplants.
In the meantime, we want to hear from you. Has a medical transplant or donation made a difference in your life? Have you donated an organ or bone marrow, or are you a regular blood or plasma donor?
Or have you or a loved one received a life-saving transplant?
Either way, we'd love to hear from you and then share your story.
Email Wisconsin Today at WPR.org to tell us about it, or you can call or text. Either way, the number is 888-642-0232. Once again, that's 888-642-0232 to call or text with your story about organ donations. Wisconsin Today producers include Beatrice Lawrence, Trevor Hook, and Lauren Cox. Our technical directors are Sarah Hopeful and Tyler Ditter. Learn more about us at WPR.org/Wisconsin Today. I'm Kate Archer-Kent.
And I'm Rob Farrett. You're listening to WPR News.